everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be a wrap up of all the books that I've read this summer, so from June, July and August. Altogether there's 15 books, so I've got quite a lot to go through. Excuse my stuffy voice, I'm recovering from a cold, so I know I sounded a little bit different. So the first book that I've got on this list is one that I was actually meant to talk about in my April-May wrap up video. And I think I came to the realisation in my last vlog that I just completely skipped over it and I hadn't mentioned it in that video, even though it was one that I gave 5 out of 5 to. So I'm going to talk about it in this one, and that is The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock. So The Devil All the Time is set in Ohio and West Virginia, and it follows from about the end of World War II up until the 60s. And we're following loads of different characters. This guy called Willard, who is a war veteran, this serial killer couple who basically go on a little road trip every so often and just kill a bunch of people. There's a preacher who is obsessed with spiders. So it's all very bizarre and it's all very dark and disturbing. But this book was so good. I loved reading about all these very interesting messed up characters. Some parts of this book genuinely made me gag. I'm not going to go into it because I've tried to block it out of my mind, but there's one character who is the most like disgusting, just nasty piece of work, and yeah, I just try not to think about that. So I just couldn't wait to like keep reading it and see where it was going. I thought it felt really atmospheric. You really feel like you're in this like rural setting, and I thought that the author did a really good job of letting you know who these characters were within a few short pages, chapters. He just really painted this whole world really well, I thought. And I also especially loved how it all came together in the end, how all these characters sort of made sense to each other. It got really tense and I genuinely didn't know what was going to happen. Plus, I then was reading the film synopsis, because this is a film on Netflix, I think. So when I was reading the differences between the film and the book, I found myself getting really protective over the book and thinking, well, that didn't happen like that in the book. Like, they just completely like cut out one of the characters who was really good. I can't remember his name, but he's the spider preacher's accomplice who's in a wheelchair, and he was such a good character and they just didn't include him in the film. So I gave this one a 5 out of 5 because I couldn't fault it. I felt very protective of it. The characters were so interesting, the whole story was just very engaging, and yeah, overall I just really loved it. I would recommend it if you have a bit of a strong stomach, because there are quite a lot of disgusting things in this book. There's lots of different trigger warnings, but it's not something that I've remembered as absolutely traumatizing or anything. Just to be mindful of that before you go into it. But other than that, I would definitely recommend this book if you like books about a wide, bizarre cast of characters and all the dark and disturbing things that they get up to. The next 3 books that I'm going to talk about were all featured in a reading vlog, so I'm just going to whiz through them pretty quickly just in case you've seen that vlog and you don't want to like hear me repeat myself again. So I'll just go through what these books are about and what my general thoughts were. But if you want to see the footage of me actually reading them, then you can click on the link and I'll put it like up here and also in the description box. So the first one I read for that video was Elizabeth is Missing by Emma Healy, and this is about a woman called Maud who suffers from dementia, and she has this fixation in her head that her friend Elizabeth is missing, and despite everyone around her, her family, her carers, telling her to just leave it be, Maud is obsessed with trying to find out what happened to her friend Elizabeth. And then we also get to see this juxtaposed with what happened to Maud's sister when she was younger, and kind of unraveling that mystery as well. So we've got 2 timelines, and overall this was a really sweet, moving book. This book is a really realistic insight into dementia and how it affects not only the person suffering from it but also the people around them. Maud herself is such a lovable, sweet, funny character. This book focuses a lot on memory, and I really like how the 2 timelines were knitted together, and although I preferred the past timeline, I thought that both mysteries were still really compelling. However, the ending of this book was a little bit too ambiguous for me personally. Sometimes I really like an ambiguous ending, but in this one I think I would have preferred a little bit more closure. And I also would have liked to have cried at this book because there were quite a lot of emotional moments, but I never really felt fully connected to the characters except for Maud. So I didn't get that full like emotional, you know. So I ended up giving this book a 3.5 out of 5. I still really like this book, it just didn't have that like lasting impact on me. Then the next book that I read for that video was The Night Swim by Megan Golding, and this is about a podcast host called Rachel. She's got a really successful podcast and she's on her 3rd season at the minute, and Whereas in her previous podcast, she's focused on solving somebody's disappearance, I think, or their murder. This time she's decided to cover a rape trial. So she basically travels to this small town and she's going to be covering this trial. So the rape trial is involving this really successful swimmer. He's been accused of raping the granddaughter of the police chief for the area, or maybe he was the police chief, I can't really remember. But this book is really well written. We get to see chapters following Rachel's perspective. We get to see the chapters of the podcast itself as she's narrating it, and then we also see this third character who is writing letters to Rachel asking her to please look into her sister's death. There's so much good commentary in this book. The podcast itself was written really well. I did listen to a little bit of it on audio just so I could get the full effect. And she had some great commentary about rape trials, speculating about why victims would even bother going to the police in the first place when they basically get victimised over and over again. Having to face cross-examination, and with rape trials being one of the hardest things to prosecute, it was all just so interesting, so upsetting. But seeing the past timeline where we're reading the letters from this girl about her sister, that was the most heartbreaking storyline. There was one bit where I had to put the book down and just collect myself because it was just so sad. This whole book was very thought-provoking, very insightful into the realities of rape trials, and it also showed this cycle of sexual violence happening in this town and how the people in this town perceived victims of sexual assault, or the people who came forward as victims and they weren't believed. It's one of those books that gets you very emotional, very angry about what's going on, and sometimes I love a book like that, but sometimes it can be a little bit too much. But yeah, this one was handled really, really well, and it had some good plot twists at the end as well that I enjoyed. So I would definitely recommend this one. I gave it a 4 out of 5, I think. And then the last book that I read for that video was The Couple Next Door by Shari Lapina. And this book focuses on two sets of couples who live next door to each other. One of the couples has a baby, and while they're at the other couple's house having a dinner party, the couple return home to go and check on their baby. They realise that the baby has gone. We then start to follow the disappearance of this baby and how the police are looking into it, and we kind of bob around in third person between different people's perspectives, which at first I wasn't really so sure on because I felt very detached from all the characters, and I didn't really like the detective's point of view. I thought it was a little bit boring, but overall I can see why it was used, and it did do the book a favour towards the end, I think. Because you were so far removed from each character's points of view, you really didn't know who to trust and you didn't know the full story, so I can understand why she did that. But unfortunately I thought it was just an average domestic thriller, really. Some parts I felt were pretty dull and forgettable, and it did feel like an effort to get through this book, but whilst it felt like effort, it was still quite an easy read. And I listened to quite a lot of it on audio over like 4 or 5 hours in one day. So it was an easy read, but I wasn't sure if I was enjoying it throughout, if that makes sense. I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 because it was fine, but I don't know. It didn't feel like a bad book, it was just not one that I loved and will remember. I've just realised I've completely forgotten to actually get the books out of my little shelves here to show you. But I do have The Couple Next Door up there and also The Night Swim. I'll probably unhaul The Couple Next Door at some point because it's just not one that I need to keep. But this is definitely one that I will be keeping, and this is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. It is quite a short fantasy book. We're following this guy called Piranesi who lives in a labyrinth of a house. It is basically what he sees as his entire world. All he does throughout his day is explore this house, document his findings, and this book is in the format of Piranesi's diaries. The only other person that he knows is this guy called the Other, who sometimes crops up in this house. But as time goes on, Piranesi starts to uncover what the house really is, who he really is, and why he's there. And Piranesi is now one of my all-time favourite characters. He's so cute, so lovable, you really just want to look after him. However, he is very naive, and at times that can be a little bit annoying, but he is just so likeable that it doesn't really matter. It was so intriguing, so mysterious. It was really hard to put down once I got into it. It's a great mix of dark academia, magical realism, fantasy, especially for someone who doesn't read a lot of fantasy like myself. It still had a lot of grounding in it that made it feel very real. I loved seeing how all the mysteries came together and being able to solve it alongside Piranesi as he's trying to work it all out. But when you realise what is really going on, it's just so good. Oh, and I also loved how it felt a bit like mixed media because we got to see the lists that he's written, we got to read articles and things that he finds, and it was just such a fun, fast little book, and I really enjoyed it. I gave this book initially 5 stars, and then I bumped it down to 4.5 out of 5 just because I'm fussy, and although I really love this book, I'm not sure it's a new favourite, but I would definitely recommend it to a lot of people. I'm going to try and get my boyfriend to read this because I think he'd really like it. I think this will appeal to a lot of different people, and if it sounds interesting to you, I will definitely give it a go. The next book that I read is a very heavy one by Kia Abdullah called Take It Back. In this book, we're following Zara, who is a female Muslim. She was a lawyer, but she decided to change career, and she now works for a domestic and sexual violence charity. One day, this girl comes in, and she's a white girl. She's disabled, which leaves her severely disfigured, and she comes in and she accuses 4 Muslim boys of raping her. And Zara, as someone who advocates for victims, decides to take on this case and supports this girl who's called Jodie, I think, right the way through as they go and arrest these boys and it goes to trial. This book is very, very heavy, but it's set in London, so it has all this great social commentary about a white girl accusing 4 Muslim boys of rape, having a female Muslim supporting the white girl, and how that affects the Muslim community and how they view Zara. There's talk about how Zara feels about her religion. She still identifies as Muslim, but she struggles with some of the elements around honour. She was in an arranged marriage, which didn't end well, and she's very distant from her family because of that. So we look into all of that. Also, there's a ton of commentary, which is very difficult to read, about why somebody would want to rape somebody who's severely disfigured and not conventionally attractive, which obviously is not relevant. Rape is often about power and about dominance, and is oftentimes nothing to do with physical sexual desire. It's more of a power thing. There's a lot about xenophobia and about how the white community start to view these Muslim boys. It's just absolutely jam-packed full of social and political commentary about this whole situation, because this rape trial basically blows up in the media and everyone is talking about it, everyone is scrutinising them, and it was just so well done. I listened to this whole book on audio and it was so well narrated. The voices were just perfect. Jodie's voice was spot on as well. Because Jodie has a facial disfigurement, Jodie's voice actor obviously had to portray this, and it was just done so well. There was so much emotion in it. And then the last 20% of the book was just so heartbreaking but so good. There's quite a lot of things that happen towards the end which are very shocking, but that ending, oh my god. It was gut-wrenching, it was perfect. It was exactly what was needed after that last 20%. I was just sat listening to it in silence, gobsmacked. It was just perfect. I really love Zara as a character. She's so strong, so powerful, but she also has a lot of internal struggles that we look at. And this book was almost perfect, but there's something that happens towards the end that I feel was glossed over a little bit. And considering that this whole book is so full of discussion and commentary, but still feeling very much like an interesting legal thriller, this one aspect of the case wasn't really looked into, and I would have just liked that a little bit more. So I ended up giving this book 4.5 out of 5 because, like I said, almost perfect. The only thing is that this book is very heavy and it will probably leave you feeling quite drained afterwards, but I would definitely recommend it as long as you are, prepared for what's to come. The next book that I read was A Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. I went into this book with pretty high expectations because it has very good ratings on Goodreads, but I ended up just feeling that this book was okay. I listened to it first on audio and then I read it on my phone as a physical version, because I feel like I was just missing something, and this is a very short book, so I did that all in one night, but I didn't find it as profound as I thought I would. In this book we're following this black boy whose brother has just been killed, and he decides that he's going to go and avenge his brother. So we're following him in the lift on the way from his apartment out to the street. He's got a gun in his pocket ready to go and find the boy who killed his brother, and in the lift we get to see the ghosts of people in his life who've been affected by gun violence, just as they talk a little bit about their stories, and our main character can process all that just before he gets out of the lift. This whole thing is told in verse, so it's very quick and easy to read. I really liked the style of this book itself. The author uses a lot of double meanings and it felt like clever writing, and he manages to convey quite a lot in very little words. And I really liked the message of this book about the cycle of violence and how if people just keep perpetuating this violence, it will just never end. I do think that maybe this is my fault that I didn't enjoy it as much, because I listened to it and I feel like I definitely skipped out on parts and didn't really register it, and then when I read it physically it was like a reread. But again, I just thought it would do more for me personally. But even though this book wasn't super impactful on me personally, I still feel like it should be taught in schools maybe. I think it could be really impactful on young people who are entrenched in gun or knife violence, where this book might be just what they need to hear to finally be able to get out of that cycle. So I do recognise the value of this book, however I just wanted it to have a little bit more of an impact on me, and although I liked it, I can't really fault it. The overall experience of reading this book was just okay. So I've given it a 3 out of 5 for me personally, but I do think in terms of the impact that this book could have, it's definitely like 4 or 5 stars because it's very accessible, very easy to read, but it has such a great message which is very important to get across in that accessible way for a lot of young people to be able to read it. So in terms of that, it's great, but for me personally, it was just okay. The next 4 books that I read were also for a reading blog, so I'm just going to whiz through these again because, like I said, I don't want to be super repetitive if you've already watched that video, but it was the John Mars reading vlog where I read The Passenger, The One, The Good Samaritan and What Lies Between Us. So The One feels like an episode of Black Mirror. We're following this dystopian society which is very similar to our own, where somebody has formulated this DNA test which tells you who your biological soulmate is, and they've been able to do this by detecting a gene within your DNA structure which matches somebody else's perfectly, and you are meant to be soulmates. So this is a really interesting book because we're following 5 different characters who have each taken the DNA test, but they're all in very different situations. So some of them are already with people, some of them are single and are looking for the right person, and one of them is the CEO for the company behind the DNA match test. So this book is told very much like a thriller where we flick between these 5 different characters and see how each of their lives unfold because of this DNA test. And this book was so good. I gave it a 5 out of 5. I couldn't stop reading it. It was so engaging. I was definitely hooked. I finished it within like 24 hours. I loved everything about it. There were so many good twists. The characters were really good and distinct. I really loved how it ended. And this book, as the first one that I read from John Mars, set the bar very high. And every other book I just kept comparing to that one. So definitely give that one a go if you like sci-fi thrillers. The next book that I'll talk about is kind of a sequel to The One, and it is The Passengers. So it's set in the same universe, but the technological advancement that we're following this time is driverless cars. A lot of people no longer have manual control of their car. They basically just press a lot of buttons and the car takes them where they need to go. So in this book we're following this character called Libby, who is brought in as the only member of the public on this jury, where they're discussing who is at fault in a driverless car accident, whether it is the person who's been in the accident or the car. Basically every single time they rule that the person who's been in the accident, as in the passerby or whatever, has been at fault. And Libby goes in there, she's seen an accident before and she doesn't think that way. So she goes in ready to like tell them all what's what, and all of a sudden a number of different driverless cars get hacked and they start broadcasting live on the internet and in this jury room, and they're basically telling them that they're all going to be crashed into each other unless they decide to save one of them. So this book feels very high stakes. I really liked some parts of it. It has a lot of good twists and a lot of good stories about why these specific passengers were chosen. It's also very political, very social. However, I feel like it went slightly downhill after the like 75-80% mark. It got a little bit boring, it got wrapped up a little bit too easily. So this is my least favourite book by John Mars, but I still give it a 3.5 because it did have really good bits to it. I really liked the parts where we were finding out more about each passenger and their story, why they were there. It had some good twists to it, but yeah, just overall not my favourite and not the one that I would like recommend. And then the first standalone book that I read of his was The Good Samaritan, where we're following this woman who works for a Samaritan hotline, but she's definitely psychologically disturbed and she really loves finding somebody who genuinely wants to kill themselves, and she will sort of guide them through it, encourage them. She gets this weird power trip from being the person to finally, you know, make someone do that. And then we're also following this guy called Ryan who suspects that this woman encouraged his sister to commit suicide. So he starts his own little investigation and his own little revenge plot against this woman. So we get to see his perspective as well, which I thought was a tiny bit boring at some points because we were just rehashing what had already happened, but it definitely got better towards the end. It was very fast paced. There were so many like shocking moments that I just did not expect whatsoever. This book gets very dark and very disturbing, and the 2 main characters are just totally insane, and the things that they do to each other to try and like outdo the other It's just bizarre. It was really fun to read, but also really frustrating because they do some very, very unlikable things, and it's hard to kind of root for either of them, but you do find yourself feeling sympathy and things. But yeah, it was very intense, very action packed. In the last like quarter of the book, it's just non-stop twist. I loved the epilogue as well. So this book had a bit of a slow start for me, but it definitely picked up towards the end, and I gave it a 4 out of 5. And then my favourite book by John Mars is What Lies Between Us. It's kind of weird to say I have a favourite when I gave the one 5 out of 5, but I also gave this 5 out of 5. But I do feel like I love this one slightly more because I just had such a good time reading it. So this book is about this mother-daughter duo who have a very, very strange relationship. For the last 25 years, they've basically been doing horrible, horrible things to each other. And in the present day, the mother is locked in the attic of the house, and the daughter kind of lets her out to have meals occasionally, but she basically keeps her trapped upstairs. So in this book, we're following both present and past timelines from when the daughter was a teenager, and it was so fun to see how these timelines were going to come together. There were so many trigger warnings. It really did pack a lot of stuff in there that was very dark, but I felt so emotional about this book because you really feel sympathy for both characters at different points. Even though they're totally messed up and very, wrong in what they do a lot of the time, you feel a lot of sympathy for them. You understand why they've done what they've done. The plot twists were relentless and were insane. The ending was so exhilarating and tense, and I just could not wait to see how this book was going to end. And it ended just how I expected, with a total bang, and it was just perfect. I would highly, highly recommend this book if you like domestic thrillers. It was a perfect mix of like thrills, plot twists, suspense, all that, but also a lot of emotional character study as well. And it was just genuinely perfect, and I could rave about this book for a long time. So highly, highly recommend that book. But if you're more into sci-fi thrillers, then I would definitely recommend the one, or if you love both, then definitely read both. The next book that I read is one that I got from the library, and that is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. This is one that I found very intriguing. I'd seen it a lot on Instagram, and although it seemed a little bit strange and a bit polarising, I was still very interested in it, so I decided to give it a go. So we're following this main character who's very entrenched in social media, and she basically lives her whole life online. She, I think, went viral for a tweet that she did, and she basically tours around the world talking about the internet, being funny. So the first half of this book is told in very small little snippets that don't really flow together, don't make a lot of sense. It did remind me of just tweets. I think that's the whole point basically, is that it's all random little thoughts that don't really make sense. They're all very like jarring next to each other. It's easy to get through and it is interesting. I have tabbed this book quite a lot, even though it's a library book. So I'm either going to take them out before I return it, or I'm going to buy a physical copy of this book and like put my tabs in it. But I don't know if I like love this book, which is weird because I've tabbed it quite a lot. I mean, I have horrible sticky note tabs. But I gave this book a 3 out of 5 because the first half is very confusing, very weird. And then in the second half, we're basically following our main character as she's going through this family tragedy, and it's very different to the first half. It's still told in quite like little snippety bits, but it's definitely more centered in real life and emotions than the online world. I did like the second half of this book more. The first half of it is absolutely full of memes, a lot of which I didn't even know. And to say that I've grown up on the internet and have seen a lot of like viral tweets, memes throughout my time, a lot of these I had no idea what they were. And I actually had to read a article, I think, I can't remember who did it now, I'll put it like down below if you're interested, but somebody basically wrote this big article about every single meme that had like appeared in this book. There were so many of them that I hadn't even heard of, so I feel like this book is quite niche because a lot of people probably won't know what a lot of these viral things are, which is surprising because they're apparently viral, but I was like, never seen that in my life. This book feels very personal to the author. The family tragedy that she talks about is something that has happened in her own life, and I'm guessing that she's very online, so I think this book is quite personal to the author. Which again makes it hard to like talk about it and rate it. But yeah, I came out of it not really sure how I felt. It was definitely a very interesting contrast between the online world and then the family tragedy. It does have a lot of good statements about being online, about social media, and about the realities of living a life online. So that's why I tabbed quite a lot of it. But I don't know if I love this book enough to actually buy it and tab it, because am I going to look at this book again? I don't know. We'll see, because I've got to decide in like a few days when this is due back. but yeah, don't really know how to convey my feelings for it. Other than it's not one I'd like recommend as such, but I did enjoy it, and if you're after something a little bit different and a bit more like thought-provoking, then this one might be good for you. The next book that I read was Night Shift by Kia Ladner. I'm very sorry if I've got that name wrong. This was such an interesting book. We're following this woman called Meg who has a boyfriend, and she works in this like office job, and Meg is just like going about her daily life when she all of a sudden becomes very obsessed with this woman called Sabine who she works with, and she doesn't know whether it's a sexual thing or if she just wants to be her. She's just very like fascinated by her. She mentions it to her boyfriend, and he's a bit like, you know, why are you so obsessed with this girl? It's a bit weird. But she eventually strikes up a friendship with Sabine, and then she finds out that Sabine is going to do the night shift for the job that they do, and Meg is like, oh my god, she's leaving, I'm going to have to do the night shift as well. So she basically changes her entire life so that she's now doing 14 straight night shifts, 14 days off. I don't know how to describe it other than there's a lot of like vibes and atmosphere in this book where we're following Meg and Sabine as they're like friends and perhaps something more. They're doing the night shift, they're going out partying. It's set in London during the 90s, and there's a lot of like drinking, drugs, sex. I just really liked the feeling of this book. Like, not a lot happens, but it's a lot about Meg's journey with her identity and her sexuality, and trying to figure out if she is attracted to women or if she's just attracted to Sabine, or if she's not even attracted to her at all. And I liked seeing how this had an impact on her and her boyfriend's relationship. I liked seeing the ups and downs to Meg and Sabine's relationship over time, and also because we're following Meg in the future as she's like looking back on this time in her life, we get to see what eventually happened, and I just thought the whole thing was so interesting and addicting. Yeah, I read this book entirely in one night, mainly on audio but then also on ebook. I just felt very engaged in the world, engaged with the characters, and yeah, it was just so easy to like get lost in, and I just really enjoyed it. This is a book that I actually removed from my TBR a while ago because I'd seen that people were like iffy about it, but I ended up adding it back on because I saw it recommended on TikTok, and I'm so glad I added it back because I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5. I'm definitely going to buy a physical copy of this book because the cover is just gorgeous and I really want to have it. It is a look at obsession, but it isn't like a thriller obsession. It is more, it gave me kind of Sally Rooney vibes if she was a little bit edgier. So if that sounds like it'll be up your street, then I would definitely recommend this one. And then the last 2 books that I read in August were actually both 5-star reads. The first one that I read is The Death of Vivek Oji by Agwake Emeze. Again, sorry if I've said that name wrong. But this book was beautiful. Obviously from the title we know that there's a character in here called Vivek who has very sadly died, and we're basically following the people around him about how they knew Vivek throughout his life, how they're dealing with his death afterwards, and there's a little bit of a mystery as to how he died as well. So this book was really, really beautifully written. It's set in Nigeria. I really loved seeing the family dynamics around Vivek, his parents, his uncles and aunties. They have this group where there's a lot of the wives of the Nigerian men who've come from elsewhere and are now settled in Nigeria. They've all sort of bonded together and all their kids are friends and stuff. It has a great sense of community, friendship, love. It just feels really nice in that way. But then obviously there's the sadness of Vivek's death. He was very young, and seeing how that has affected his family as they react to it differently. And then the ending of this book, even though you know what's coming and you know what's already happened, the ending of this book was absolutely heartbreaking. I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. So this book obviously had a very deep effect on me. I would have liked a little bit more about Vivek in this book himself, like from his perspective, or maybe seeing his life a little bit more like towards the end, but I can totally see why that wasn't included, and I think the way that it was written had the most like emotional impact, so I think that was the right choice. If anything, I think it's a good thing that it's left me like wanting more, especially because this book is fairly short. I think it's only 248 pages, but this author managed to pack so much character history in this book, and it just feels very like rich and emotional, and it was just great. I cannot fault it at all. So yeah, definitely a well-deserved 5 out of 5. And then the last book that I read in August, which was also a 5 out of 5, was Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This book, oh my god, how do I even talk about this book? So in this book we're following Natsuki, who is 11, and every year her family reunite at her grandma's house where they have this big family celebration, and every year she really looks forward to seeing her cousin Yu. They're very close. They both believe that they are aliens because they feel very different to everyone else and they feel quite isolated. So we're following a little bit about Natsuki's childhood, and then we skip probably about 20 years in the future, where Natsuki is now in an asexual marriage. She still believes that she's an alien, and she decides to go back to this family house, reunite with her cousin, and things just get bizarre from there. So this book has a hell of a lot of trigger warnings in it. I just loved how unexpected it all felt. The start of this book is very childlike, very naive. The dialogue is very like simplistic, and then as you get towards the end, there's just more and more bizarre shit happening. I thought it had great commentary on society and feeling isolated, feeling like you're an alien among other people, and I just loved being in Natsuki's brain and seeing her thoughts, and she was just a fascinating character. And yeah, the ending of this book was bizarre and shook me to my core. I was disturbed, but I loved it. It was kind of the perfect ending. It was a very fast read, and I definitely feel like I'm going to reread it one day. Easy 5 out of 5. Would highly recommend if you're into the bizarre. And that is all the books that I want to talk to you about today. That is all the books that I read in June, July and August, all 15 of them. Let me know what you thought of this video. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more. Let me know what videos you want to see next. I think I'm going to start a horror reading vlog today actually, because I'm really in the mood now that it's autumn. I'm in like my fluffy jacket and I just want to read scary shit. So I might start that today, but yeah, let me know what else you want to see. Let me know what you've been reading. If you've read any of these books before, tell me what you thought, and I will hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!